You think you know why your plants aren't thriving? Medieval peasants had zero education, no fertilizers, no technology, yet somehow grew crops twice as fast as we do today. Their secret ingredient was everywhere, completely free, and absolutely nauseating. What were they putting on their plants that were too squeamish to try? You know what's funny about medieval farmers? Everyone thinks they were just bumbling around with pitchforks and prayers. Well, they discovered something that would make modern agriculture executives weep with envy. These dirt-covered geniuses figured out that certain plants are basically best friends forever. Not the kind that gossip about you behind your back, but the type that actually makes each other stronger, healthier, and more productive. We're talking about companion planting, and it was like medieval farmers had cracked the code to plant psychology. Here's how brilliant this was. They'd plant peas right next to corn stalks. The corn would shoot up tall and strong, giving the peas something to climb on instead of flopping around like a teenager trying to stand up after binge-watching Netflix. But the peas weren't just freeloading. Those sneaky little pods were secretly fixing nitrogen from the air and pumping it straight into the soil, feeding their corn buddy like a personal chef. The chemistry behind this is wild. Plants release chemicals through their roots and leaves, kind of like how your grandfather's aftershave announces his presence 3 rooms away. Some of these plant chemicals actually ward off pests that would normally munch on their neighbors. Others boost growth hormones in nearby plants. Medieval farmers saw this magic happening without understanding the science. They just knew that when they planted certain combinations together, their harvests exploded. A farmer might pair basil with tomatoes, and suddenly those tomatoes tasted better and grew bigger. The basil was basically acting like a bodyguard, keeping aphids and hornworms at bay. Then there's the classic trio that Native Americans taught European settlers: corn, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters. The corn provided support, the beans fixed nitrogen, and the squash spread out like a living mulch, keeping weeds down and soil moist. It was teamwork that would make corporate consultants jealous. Studies today show that effective plant partnerships can boost yields by up to 50%. That's not just a little improvement. That's the difference between scraping by and throwing a harvest feast that makes your neighbors green with envy. Modern organic gardeners still swear by these combinations. Marigolds with vegetables, carrots with onions, nasturtiums with cucumbers. The principles haven't changed because science hasn't changed. Plants still release the same helpful chemicals their ancestors did centuries ago. But companion planting was just the beginning of medieval farming wizardry. Wait until you hear about their mulching tricks. They turned garbage into garden gold using methods that would make your composting efforts look like amateur hour. Now here's where medieval farmers got really creative with their garbage, and trust me, what they considered mulch would make your modern compost bin look like a 5-star restaurant. Medieval mulching wasn't just throwing some grass clippings around your tomatoes and calling it a day. These folks layered everything they could get their hands on over their garden beds: straw, leaves, rotting vegetables, and yes, other things we'll get to in a moment. But the genius part, it worked like a charm. Think about it this way. Your soil is basically a giant sponge that's constantly losing water to the sun. Medieval farmers figured out that covering that sponge with a thick blanket of organic matter was like putting a lid on a pot of boiling water. The moisture stayed put. But wait, there's more. These decomposing layers didn't just save water. They slowly released nutrients back into the soil. It's like having a slow-release fertilizer that costs absolutely nothing. Well, except for the smell. The weeds, forget about it. When you pile 6 inches of organic matter on top of the ground, those pesky plants can't even see daylight, let alone grow. Medieval farmers were essentially smothering their competition while feeding their crops. Pretty clever for people who thought the earth was flat, right? What's really fascinating is how this simple technique solved multiple problems at once: less watering, fewer weeds, better soil nutrition, and protection from temperature swings. Modern gardeners pay good money for fancy landscape fabric and drip irrigation systems to accomplish what these folks did with their kitchen scraps and barn sweepings. The science backs this up too. Studies show that proper mulching can reduce water evaporation by up to 70%. That's not just convenient. In medieval times, when dragging water from the well was your daily workout, it was a game changer. Even today's organic gardening movement has basically rediscovered what medieval farmers knew all along. Those trendy no-till methods and permaculture techniques, medieval mulching is their great-great-grandfather. Here's the kicker, though. While modern gardeners debate the perfect carbon-to-nitrogen ratio and worry about pH levels, medieval farmers just piled stuff on and watched it work. Sometimes the old-school approach beats all our fancy calculations. But if you think mulching was gross, wait until you hear about their fertilizer recipes. Let's just say they took the phrase, waste not, want not, to places that would make a sewage treatment plant worker blush. Winter was the enemy of every medieval farmer. Frost would kill their seedlings faster than you could say, there goes dinner. But clever farmers figured out a brilliant workaround that would make modern gardeners jealous. They built what we now call cold frames, basically wooden boxes topped with glass or oiled cloth. Think of them as medieval greenhouses, except your grandmother could probably build one with her knitting needles and some leftover fence posts. Here's where it gets interesting. These simple contraptions could extend growing seasons by months. While their neighbors were staring at frozen dirt, smart farmers were harvesting fresh lettuce in December. The glass trapped heat during sunny days and released it slowly at night, creating a cozy microclimate that plants absolutely loved. But the real genius was in the timing. Farmers would start seeds in these frames weeks before the last frost, giving their crops a massive head start. By the time spring officially arrived, they had robust seedlings ready to transplant into their main gardens. Meanwhile, everyone else was just beginning to plant seeds. The temperature difference inside these frames was dramatic, sometimes 20 to 30 degrees warmer than outside air. That's like having Florida weather in your backyard while living in Minnesota. Plants that normally couldn't survive harsh winters suddenly became year-round producers. Italian farmers perfected this technique during the 13th century, growing herbs and vegetables through brutal alpine winters. They discovered that certain cold-resistant varieties could actually thrive in these protected environments, producing tender leaves while snow piled up outside. What's fascinating is how resourceful they were with materials. Wealthy farmers used expensive glass panes, but clever peasants made do with stretched animal bladders, oiled parchment, or even thin sheets of horn. As long as it let light through and kept cold air out, it worked. The results spoke for themselves. Historical records show farmers using cold frames could harvest crops almost year-round, giving them enormous advantages in local markets. Fresh vegetables in February, that was like striking gold. Modern gardeners have rediscovered these techniques, calling them season extenders and charging premium prices for fancy versions. But the basic principle remains unchanged. Create a protected environment where plants can grow when nature says they shouldn't. These medieval cold frames were essentially the great-grandfathers of today's greenhouse industry. Pretty impressive for technology that required zero electricity and could be built with scraps from the barn. Speaking of barn scraps, medieval farmers had another trick that was even more resourceful and significantly more disgusting. Medieval farmers stumbled onto something that would make modern agricultural scientists weep with joy. They figured out that planting the same crop in the same spot year after year was like asking your teenager to clean their room every day. Eventually, you're going to get diminishing returns. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just random farmers throwing seeds around hoping for the best. They developed what historians call the three-field system. And it was basically crop rotation on steroids. Picture this. One field gets wheat or rye. Another gets barley, oats, or legumes. The third? It takes a vacation. Just sits there doing absolutely nothing like your Uncle Bob during family gatherings. This resting field wasn't being lazy, though. It was regenerating nutrients that the previous crops had sucked dry. The results were staggering. Farmers who adopted this rotation system saw yields increase by up to 100% compared to those stubborn folks who kept planting the same crops in the same spots. That's like doubling your salary by simply changing your daily routine. Then there's the pest control angle that nobody talks about. When you keep planting corn in the same field, corn-loving bugs throw themselves a permanent party. But rotate beans next year, those party crashers suddenly find themselves at the wrong celebration, like showing up to a wedding in a Halloween costume. Medieval farmers noticed something else fascinating. Certain crops actually improved the soil for whatever came next. Legumes, peas, beans, lentils were like nature's vitamins, pumping nitrogen back into tired earth. Modern science now knows these plants have special bacteria on their roots that literally manufacture fertilizer. Medieval farmers didn't understand the chemistry, but they sure understood the results. Disease prevention was another bonus they discovered. Plant diseases are surprisingly picky eaters. A fungus that loves wheat won't stick around when you switch to barley. It's like changing the locks on your house. The unwanted visitors can't get in anymore. Well, the beauty of this system was its simplicity. No fancy equipment, no mysterious chemicals, just common sense applied systematically. Some regions used four-field or even more complex rotations, treating their farmland like a chess game where every move set up the next advantage. Modern sustainable agriculture has basically taken medieval rotation principles and dressed them up with scientific explanations. But here's what those ancient farmers knew that we're still learning. Sometimes the grossest solutions produce the most remarkable results. You know what they say about one person's trash being another's treasure? Well, medieval farmers took that saying and ran straight to the outhouse with it. These resourceful folks discovered that human waste wasn't just waste at all. It was liquid gold for their gardens. Here's the thing that'll make you squirm. They actually mixed human urine with fresh manure to create what they called night soil. Sounds fancy, right? Don't let the name fool you. This concoction was basically a cocktail of everything your body decided it didn't need anymore. But here's where it gets interesting. That yellow stuff we flush away without a second thought, it's absolutely packed with nitrogen. We're talking about 15 to 20 times more nitrogen than your average compost pile. Medieval farmers figured this out centuries before scientists even knew what nitrogen was. They'd collect urine in clay pots, kind of like having a really gross savings account, and then dilute it with water. The magic ratio was usually 1 part urine to 10 parts water. Any stronger, and they'd literally burn their plants to a crisp. Talk about learning the hard way. And the dung? Well, that brought phosphorus and potassium to the party. Think of it as nature's own fertilizer factory, complete with a built-in delivery system. These farmers were basically running a recycling program that would make modern environmentalists weep with joy. The results were nothing short of spectacular. Plants grew faster than a teenager's appetite. Vegetables became bigger and more robust. Grain yields doubled, sometimes tripled, compared to unfertilized plots. Medieval farmers were essentially turning their bodily functions into agricultural superpowers. Now, before you start getting any bright ideas about your own garden, remember these folks had serious systems in place. They'd age the mixture for months, sometimes years. Fresh waste could spread diseases faster than gossip at a church social. The aging process killed off the dangerous bacteria while preserving all those precious nutrients. Modern research backs up what these medieval masters knew instinctively. Studies show that properly processed human waste can outperform expensive synthetic fertilizers. It's like comparing grandma's homemade soup to something from a can. There's just no contest. But wait until you hear about their next trick. While they were busy recycling waste, medieval farmers also discovered they could literally cut and paste their way to better crops. The technique they developed would make modern geneticists scratch their heads in amazement. Medieval farmers basically invented plant surgery, and honestly, they were better at it than most people today are at assembling IKEA furniture. Grafting became their secret weapon for creating Frankenstein plants that could survive anything Mother Nature threw at them. Here's how it worked. They'd take a cutting from one plant and literally attach it to another, like performing a botanical organ transplant without anesthesia. The bottom part, called the rootstock, provided the foundation and disease resistance. The top part, the scion, brought the desirable fruit or flowers. Together, they created a plant hybrid that was tougher than a $2 steak. Apple trees were their favorite patients. Wild apple rootstock was incredibly hardy, but produced fruit that tasted like wooden disappointment. So medieval gardeners would graft branches from sweet apple varieties onto these tough roots. Suddenly, they had trees that could survive harsh winters while producing fruit that didn't require a hammer to eat. The technique sounds simple, but it required surgical precision. Farmers had to match the cambium layers perfectly. That's the thin green tissue just under the bark where all the magic happens. 1 millimeter off, and the whole operation failed. They'd slice both plants at precise angles, fit them together like puzzle pieces, then wrap everything with strips of cloth or tree bark. Timing was everything too. Spring was grafting season when the sap started flowing, but before leaves appeared. Think of it as catching plants during their morning coffee, awake enough to heal, but not too busy growing to pay attention to their new appendage. But here's where medieval farmers got really clever. They didn't just graft for better fruit. They created multi-variety trees that could pollinate themselves. One apple tree might have 4 different types of branches, turning a single tree into an entire orchard. Talk about maximizing your real estate. The survival rate? About 70% when done correctly. Not bad for medieval plant surgery performed with basic knives and prayer. Compare that to modern success rates, and those old farmers weren't fooling around. Wine grapes became another grafting success story. When certain soil conditions threatened vine health, farmers would graft their prized grape varieties onto hardier rootstock. The result? Vines that laughed at poor soil while still producing grapes worthy of the Lord's table. What really blows my mind is how they figured out compatibility. No internet research or agricultural extension offices. Just trial, error, and probably a few colorful medieval curse words when grafts failed. Yet grafting was just one piece of their growth-boosting puzzle. They had another trick that involved creating liquid plant food from the most unexpected ingredients. Well, here's where medieval farming gets really funky. Farmers back then discovered they could make their own liquid plant food by letting various plants rot in water for weeks. Yeah, you heard that right. They basically made plant soup and sprayed it all over their crops. The process was disgustingly simple. Take nettle leaves, comfrey, or even seaweed if you live near the coast, stuff them into wooden barrels with water, and wait. And wait some more. After about 3 to 6 weeks of fermenting in the sun, you'd have a brown, smelly liquid that could make your eyes water from 50 feet away. But here's the kicker. It actually worked like magic. These fermented concoctions were packed with nutrients that plants could absorb directly through their leaves. Think of it as medieval energy drinks for vegetables, except they smelled like a teenager's gym socks mixed with rotten eggs. The farmers didn't care about the stench, though, because their crops were growing faster than gossip in a small town. Nettle-based sprays were particularly popular because nettles are loaded with nitrogen, iron, and potassium. Farmers would dilute this green goop, usually 1 part fermented juice to 10 parts water, and spray it on everything from beans to fruit trees. The results were often visible within days. What made this technique so brilliant was the delivery method. Instead of waiting for nutrients to travel up through the roots, plants could absorb what they needed directly through their leaf surfaces. It's like getting vitamins through an IV instead of swallowing pills. Much faster and more efficient. Medieval records show that crops treated with these fermented sprays often grew 30 to 50% faster than untreated ones. Leaves turned greener, fruits grew larger, and harvests came earlier. Some farmers swore their tomatoes grew so fast they could practically watch them expand. The best part? This wasn't some expensive imported fertilizer. Farmers used weeds growing right outside their doors. Dandelions, plantain, even grass clippings could be turned into plant growth boosters. Talk about recycling at its finest. They were turning garden waste into garden gold. Modern organic farmers still use variations of these fermented plant teas today, though thankfully we figured out ways to make them smell slightly less offensive. But even with our fancy equipment and scientific knowledge, we're basically copying what medieval farmers figured out through pure trial and very smelly error. Speaking of smelly medieval innovations, wait until you hear about their approach to soil preparation. It involved some serious muscle work and rocks. Medieval farmers had a brilliant trick that sounds absolutely bonkers today. They used stones as their secret weapon for better soil. Not just any rocks lying around, mind you. These crafty agricultural pioneers figured out that strategically placed stones could transform dead, compacted earth into a plant paradise. Here's where it gets interesting. While most people think stones are just obstacles in farming, medieval farmers knew better. They deliberately incorporated rocks into their plowing routine, using them to break up those stubborn, cement-hard layers of soil that choke plant roots. Think of it like giving the earth a deep tissue massage, except with boulders instead of gentle hands. The technique worked like this. Farmers would drag stone-weighted plows across their fields, letting the rocks punch holes and create channels in compacted soil. These weren't random scratches either. The stones created specific patterns that allowed air and water to penetrate deep underground, reaching places that regular plows couldn't touch. But why stones? Well, medieval farmers were basically broke most of the time. They couldn't afford fancy metal tools that we take for granted today. Rocks were free, abundant, and here's the kicker, they lasted forever. Your great-great-grandfather's plow stone could outlive 3 generations of farmers. Talk about a solid investment. The results were genuinely impressive. Historical records show that fields treated with stone plowing produced significantly more crops than regular tilled land. Poor quality soil that barely grew weeds suddenly burst with healthy plants. It was like watching a botanical miracle, except the miracle came from good old-fashioned physics. Medieval farmers also discovered something modern scientists confirm. Compacted soil is a plant killer. When dirt gets packed down tight, roots can't spread, water can't soak in, and air can't circulate. Plants essentially suffocate in their own homes. Stone plowing solved this problem centuries before anyone understood the science behind it. The beauty of this method was its simplicity. You didn't need to be a genius to drag rocks across dirt. Even the most stubborn farmer could see immediate results. Softer soil that crumbled in their hands instead of sitting like concrete. Modern farming still uses these principles, though we've upgraded from dragging boulders around. Today's deep tillage equipment follows the same basic idea. Break up compacted layers so plants can breathe and grow properly. Those medieval stone draggers were onto something big. They proved that sometimes the most effective solutions are hiding right under your feet. Literally. Their rock-solid farming wisdom laid the groundwork for techniques that still feed the world today.